As it becomes increasingly clear that the 2024 federal election will see a rematch between former President Donald Trump and the incumbent President Joe Biden, voters are afforded an unusual opportunity to judge both candidates not simply on campaign promises, but on the regulatory record of their presidencies. Unlike the measured, targeted stimulus packages Congress released from the Trump's presidency, the ARP sought to achieve long-term Democratic policy goals under the disguise of an immediate response to the challenges of coronavirus. It is increasingly likely that affordable housing will take a central place in presidential policy debate. Hello, and welcome to Francis Comfort News Channel. I am your host, Kaylee on the spot, reporting to you live regarding Trump versus Biden administration initiatives. On this channel, we discuss all things related to real estate. Please hit the subscribe button to follow for more. A Biden-Trump election contest affords voters the unusual opportunity to compare the presidential records of both candidates in assessing the next presidency's likely impact on housing policy. The Trump presidency was characterized by efforts to capitalize the government-sponsored enterprises with a view to privatization, while the Biden presidency instead reversed much of this progress in the failed pursuit of affordable housing goals while ignoring safety and soundness mandates. The next president will need to navigate a complex web of ongoing and new policy concerns, from the appropriate role of the GSEs to the nation's persistent lack of housing inventory, issues that will be challenging enough even without the background of persistent high inflation. As it becomes increasingly clear that the 2024 federal election will see a rematch between former President Donald Trump and the incumbent President Joe Biden, voters are afforded an unusual opportunity to judge both candidates not simply on campaign promises, but on the regulatory record of their presidencies. Housing inventory is at record lows, prices remain high, and shelter is the single most significant contributor to consumer price inflation. It is increasingly likely that affordable housing will take a central place in presidential policy debate. Now we will discuss Trump's administration initiatives. Early into Donald Trump's presidency, his administration issued a wide-ranging reform and reorganization plan for the federal government, which indicated an intention to embark on mortgage finance reform via the privatization of government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. A healthy and free secondary mortgage market requires that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac be stripped of the systemic privileges that have allowed them to dominate the industry artificially. That the GSEs have remained wards of the state since 2000 and 2008 financial crisis represents an omission made all more astonishing given the primary role of the collapse of subprime mortgages in triggering the crisis. Yet, the Trump administration remains the only administration to advance the cause of GSE privatization. Hot on the heels of 2 days of hearings in the Senate Committee on Banking and Housing, Urban Affairs, the Trump White House released a presidential memo directing primarily Treasury Secretary Steve to develop a plan for comprehensive housing finance reform. Treasury released a sweeping blueprint for regulatory reform, providing detailed instructions to Congress and the Federal Housing Finance Agency. 10 years after the Housing and Economic Recovery Act introduced safety and soundness regulations, that included requiring the FHFA director to advance a risk-based capital framework for the GSEs. The FHFA finally released their proposal on enterprise capital requirements. The proposal would require that the GSEs holding capital the higher of the minimum leverage ratio or a risk-based capital requirement. Yet, given the proposal would have only gone into effect if the GSEs were removed from the conservatorship and recapitalized, the proposed rule, while welcome, remained an unlikely proposition. The year 2019 saw significant administrative housing finance reform under FHFA Director Mark. The jewel in the crown of these reforms was a significant project of recapitalization that saw the leverage ratio of the GSEs improve from 1,000 to 1 to 500 to 1, significantly reducing the risk the GSEs pose in the event of another housing crisis. The FHFA followed this up with a re-proposed capital rule that would require Fannie and Freddie to hold a combined $244 billion in capital, far higher than the combined $23.5 billion they held at the time, and would add a significant number of additional capital buffers borrowed liberally from banking regulation. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, requires that all mortgage borrowers have a debt-to-income ratio of below 43%, but it created an expectation for mortgages backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The QM patch allows Fannie and Freddie to breach CFPB regulations by backing mortgages to borrowers with a higher ratio of debt to income. But in early 2019, the CFPB indicated that it will allow the QM match to expire in 2021, eliminating this privilege. While allowing the QM patch to expire likely decrease mortgage availability, particularly for those with low incomes, it also necessarily significantly decreased the systemic risk implicit in the U.S. housing sector. In the face of the economic and social disruption caused by the pandemic, Congress passed 3 significant stimulus packages to provide relief to the American economy, businesses, and consumers. With the estimated $1 trillion price tag, the third stimulus package is one of the largest and most significant stimulus packages in U.S. history. The CARES Act will also allow those with mortgages backed by federal loans to request 6 months of mortgage forbearance. Tenants of homes that receive this forbearance could neither be evicted nor charged fees or penalties for the non-payment of rent. In addition, the CARES Act appropriated to the Department of Housing and Urban Development $5 billion in additional funding for community development block grants, as well as additional funds for housing programs designed to support vulnerable communities. Moving on to Biden's administration initiatives. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 represented the Biden's administration response to COVID-19 in the form of $1.9 trillion stimulus plan. Unlike the measured targeted stimulus packages Congress released from the Trump's presidency, the ARP sought to achieve long-term Democratic policy goals under the disguise of an immediate response to the challenges of coronavirus, directly causing the rapid inflation that remains in place today. For housing, the most significant aspect of ARP was $40 billion in housing aid, although noticeably absent were any extension to the eviction moratorium. Since taking office, President Biden made clear his desire to vastly expand the roles of the GSEs in the provision of subsidized affordable housing. The new FHFA Director Sandra Thompson took little to no time to reverse reform progress made under Director Mark. To the Biden administration, the role of the FHFA is to use the GSEs to provide affordable housing, seemingly at any cost, and that is more important that the FHFA director empower this mission than perform the statutory duties as a safety and soundness regulator. To this end, the Biden administration has expanded the role of the GSEs in the market increase the risk they pose, and move the GSEs back to where they were before, without hope of privatization. Most notably, in September 2021, the FHFA suspended portions of the agreement between itself and the GSEs, allowing the GSEs to ignore limits on loans on second homes, the GSE's involvement in multifamily markets, and the cash window limits the GSEs have access to. The most troubling implication, however, was the suspension of the restriction on higher risk loans, allowing the GSEs once again to purchase loans with elevated risk characteristics. The Federal Housing Administration has significantly expanded its roles since the financial crisis, and with the GSEs guarantees over $7 trillion in mortgage-related debt to the borrowers least able to repay. The FHA's book of mortgages is considered so toxic that even Ginnie Mae, the Government National Mortgage Association, has proposed a 250% risk weight on gross mortgage service rights that make up the majority of the FHA's business. Former FHFA Director Mark has warned that the FHA is setting the market up for failure with its poor underwriting standards, the risk of which could topple the housing market. Shortly after suspending part of the governing agreement, the FHFA announced in a proposed rulemaking that it would amend the GSE's Enterprise Regulatory Capital Framework, reducing the amount of capital the GSEs will be required to hold. Allowing the GSEs to hold onto more capital makes them significantly less vulnerable to economic stress. And indeed, the GSEs do not hold anything like the capital required by the Federal Reserve if they were private entities. The FHFA only a day later proposed easing the enterprise capital requirements on the GSEs from the 4% set under the previous administration to 3%. In effect, cutting the combined capital requirement of the GSEs from $294 billion to $220 billion. In December 2020, the CFPB announced via notice of proposed rulemaking that it would extend the date at which new QM rules would come into effect, effectively delaying the sunset. Fortunately, the effects of this delay were somewhat mitigated by additional advice released by the GSEs in April 2021, indicating that they would cease buying loans that do not meet the revised QM rules. The next president would need to navigate a complex web of ongoing and new policy concerns. From the appropriate role of the GSEs to the nation's persistent lack of housing inventory, these issues will be more challenging even without the background of persistent high inflation. But when it comes to housing policies, the American public can access both candidates' ability to tackle future challenges based on their track records. I do believe that is very true. We should not believe and go off of what the president or the upcoming president candidate is promising us. We need to go off on what their resume says. Does their resume say they value affordable housing? Does their resume say they really do want to bring solutions to affordable housing? What did they do in the pandemic? The pandemic rock people's boat and rock people's world to where they're still not standing on their feet to today. So that track record of that time needs to really be taken into for the next presidency. Again, my name is Kingsley on the spot. I appreciate you guys for stopping by today. I will see you on the next one. Have a nice day.